Welcome back to Inside the Philippines. If you've been watching this channel for a while, you know the stories we tell here. Men who came looking for love, or warmth, or just a second chance at something. Men who lost money, lost time, sometimes lost everything. We've heard from truck drivers and teachers, retired police officers, guys who mortgaged their dignity along with their savings. Today's story is a little different. Today we're hearing from Wolfgang, 61 years old, from Dortmund in Germany. Spent 30 years in IT support, the man who fixed everyone else's problems for a living. When he arrived in the Philippines, he didn't come naive. He came prepared. He'd done the research, run the numbers, built himself what he genuinely believed was a system to protect him from exactly the kind of story we usually tell on this channel. He even designed a test. And here's the thing about Wolfgang's story that I want you to hold in your mind as you listen. The test worked. He got his answer. He got out before it cost him everything. But getting the answer you designed your test to find, that's not always the same as being okay. This one's going to stay with you. Here's his story, in his own words. My name is Wolfgang Bauer. And before I tell you about the Philippines, I need to tell you about the help desk. 30 years. Not quite 30. 29 years and 8 months, if you want to be precise, which I always do. IT support technician at a logistics company in Dortmund. Mid-sized firm. Maybe 800 employees at the peak. I was not the head of the department. I was not the person who gave presentations. I was the person who answered when the presentations stopped working. You know what that job actually is? You are the person everyone is relieved to see, and relieved to see leave. You arrive because something is broken. You fix it. You go. Nobody thinks about you until the next time something breaks. In 29 years and 8 months, I estimate I closed somewhere between 40 and 50,000 support tickets. I know this because I kept records. I kept records of everything. That is important for later. My marriage ended in 2001, March, a Tuesday. I came home from work. I remember it was a Tuesday because we had a server migration scheduled for Wednesday, and I was thinking about the migration checklist. And Margaret had left a note on the kitchen counter. It was written on the back of a grocery receipt. Very neat handwriting. She was gone. She had gone to her sister's in Münster. She was not coming back. I want to be accurate here, I spent approximately the next 2 decades trying to understand what went wrong. Not in an emotional way, you understand. More the way you would approach a system failure where the error log gives you nothing useful. Something stopped working. The diagnostic came back empty. I couldn't find the fault. I told people I was fine. I was fine. I went to work. I fixed the problems. I came home. I ate correctly, slept correctly, exercised occasionally. I had a flat in Essen that I kept very clean. I had a colleague named Peter, with whom the first sometimes had coffee. I told Peter the first was fine also. There is a photograph of Margaret in a drawer in my desk. It has been in that drawer since 2001. I do not look at it often, probably not as rarely as I told myself. In October 2023, the company announced restructuring. They offered early retirement packages to anyone over 58. The terms were generous. I did the calculation 3 times before I believed it. I took the package. I cleaned out my desk on a Friday afternoon. Nobody organized a goodbye. One of the younger technicians sent a message saying good luck. That was approximately correct, as a summary of the previous 29 years. I sold the flat in Essen in January 2024. The market was reasonable. After everything, the estate agent, the taxes, the small repairs I'd put off for years, I had 158,000 euros sitting in my account. This was the most money I had ever had in my life, at one time. I want to be honest about what that felt like. It felt correct, and it felt dangerous, in roughly equal measure. I moved into a rented room in Bochum. Cheaper. No reason to stay in Essen specifically. No reason to go anywhere specifically, which was the larger problem. I sat at my desk in a room with somebody else's curtains, and I opened my laptop. I had a calendar with nothing in it. For the first time in 30 years, I had no tickets to close. I need you to understand something about how I am built. I am not a person who does well with nothing to solve. When there is a problem, I function. When there is no problem, I look for one. It is not a personality trait I am particularly proud of. But it is accurate. I want to be careful here about how I describe what I was looking for. I told myself I was not, looking for a woman because I was lonely. I was looking for a logical next step. A retired man of 61 with sufficient savings and no dependents has several reasonable options for maximizing quality of life in the final quarter of his career. Relocation is one of them. Southeast Asia appears repeatedly in the relevant research. This is a very German way to be unhappy. I understand that now. I spent approximately 3 weeks reading everything I could find. Expat forums, Reddit, Facebook groups for retired foreigners. I built a spreadsheet comparing cost of living across Thailand, Vietnam, Malaysia, and the Philippines. Monthly rent, food costs, health care, visa requirements, typical expat experience. Thailand I eliminated fairly quickly. The forums were full of stories about a particular kind of bar culture in Pattaya and Phuket. I read enough to understand the dynamics and decide I did not want to be anywhere near them. Not for moral reasons especially, just because the whole system seemed designed to separate a man from his money in ways that were not interesting to me. Vietnam was appealing. History, food, a real culture with depth. But the language looked genuinely impenetrable, and I could not find reliable information about whether German retirees could navigate the visa system without a local facilitator. I don't like depending on facilitators. The Philippines kept appearing in my research with a specific combination of factors. English spoken natively, strong Catholic values which the forums consistently associated with more serious relationship intentions, warm climate, cost of living roughly 60% below Germany, and, I will be honest, multiple forum posts from Western men saying that Filipino women tended to be warmer toward older European men than the local culture at home. I noted this. I also noted that approximately half of those forum posts were written by men who subsequently described being financially ruined. I read those posts too. I took notes. On the 3rd of February 2024, I joined Christian Filipina. I chose it specifically over Filipino Cupid because the religious framing suggested a more serious user base, less transactional. That was my hypothesis. I built my profile carefully. Accurate age, real photograph, recent, no flattering angles I would not be able to replicate in person. Honest description, retired IT technician, German, non-smoker, no children, financially stable. I did not specify the amount. Financially stable seemed sufficient and accurate. I received 43 messages in the first 7 days. I opened a spreadsheet and began reading them systematically. So, 43 messages in the first week. I want to explain what I did with those 43 messages, because it tells you something about how I approach problems and also, probably, something unflattering about how I approach people. I created a spreadsheet, columns for username, age, location, message content, whether she used my name or a generic greeting, time sent, and a notes field. I read each message once, made my assessments, and entered the data. This took approximately 2 hours on a Sunday evening. I had a cup of coffee. It was very quiet in the room with somebody else's curtains. 31 of the 43 messages I eliminated in the first pass. The reasons varied, but the pattern was consistent. Hello, handsome, with no other content. Questions about my financial situation in the opening message. Not subtle questions, direct ones, sometimes in the second sentence. Profile photos that looked like they had been taken by a professional, which on a dating site for people of modest means is its own kind of information. One message that began, "Dear Beloved," which I will not comment on further. 8 more I eliminated after brief exchanges. The conversations moved too quickly toward a certain destination. I could see the architecture of it. The warmth that arrived before any reason for warmth existed. I feel like I can really talk to you after 4 messages. I am not a suspicious person by nature, but I am a person who notices when a process deviates from what it should logically be doing. That left 4 conversations I continued. Rosalie was the third of the 4. Her first message was about German energy policy. I have thought about this many times since. It was a strange opener. She had read in my profile that I was German and retired from a technical background, and she had apparently formed a question she actually wanted to ask. She wanted to know whether I thought Germany had made a mistake closing the nuclear plants after Fukushima, because she had read a news article about it and found the reasoning confusing. I sat and looked at this message for a moment. Then I wrote back my actual opinion, which is that it was a political decision made in response to public emotion rather than engineering data, and that the consequences for Germany's energy grid were predictable and predicted by the people whose job it was to predict them. She replied disagreeing, partially. She cited a specific concern about waste storage that I hadn't addressed. She was not wrong to raise it. We argued, politely, for 3 exchanges. By the end, I had more or less updated my position slightly. I noted this in the spreadsheet. Her profile said, Rosalie, 34 years old, Cagayan de Oro, Mindanao. Nursing assistant at a private clinic. Catholic. Described herself as the eldest in her family. Independent. Not looking for financial support, but for a genuine partner. Her profile photos showed a woman in nursing scrubs in one, casual clothes outside what looked like a church in another, and one hiking photo on what I later learned was somewhere in the Bukidnon Highlands above Cagayan de Oro. No professional lighting. No poses. We moved to video calls in early March. I want to say something about what those first calls were like, because I don't want to give the wrong impression. I was not swept away. I am 61 years old, and I have been alone for 23 years. And I know what it feels like when something is happening versus when you are telling yourself something is happening. This was genuinely something happening, and I was watching it with the slightly split attention of a man who has learned to be cautious of his own responses. Rosalie on video was warmer than Rosalie in text, a little less formal. She laughed more easily. Her English was excellent, better than many of my German colleagues, honestly, with a soft accent that I had to train my ear to for the first few calls. She called me Wolfgang, never shortened it, which I appreciated. Most people call me Wolf, which I have never liked. We talked about, ordinary things. Her work at the clinic, my old job, what we ate. She cooked her own meals, which she mentioned almost defensively, as though she expected me to find it unusual. She told me about going to Mass on Sunday mornings at a church near her apartment, and how the priest there gave very long sermons, but she found the structure of it calming. I told her I was not religious. She said that was fine. She wasn't looking to convert anyone. 3 calls a week. 45 minutes, sometimes an hour. For 4 months. I sent nothing during this period. No money, no gifts. I want to be very clear about this because I was clear about it to myself at the time. I treated it as a data point in her favor. 4 months of consistent contact, no financial requests. This was, I told my colleague Peter when we had coffee in April, evidence of genuine intentions. Peter raised an eyebrow. Peter is not a romantic person, but he is occasionally wise. He said, "Or she's playing a longer game, Wolfgang." I told him that was excessively cynical. I believe I used the word paranoid. I think about that coffee with Peter fairly often now. The calls had a rhythm. She always had her phone propped against something on her kitchen table, so I could see the corner of her apartment behind her. A small clean space, a wooden cross on the wall, a fan running constantly in the Cagayan de Oro heat. I learned to read the background the way you learn to read a work environment. The details were consistent. The same cross, the same fan, the same shelf of nursing textbooks she was apparently updating for a certification. One thing I noticed, and I logged it, because I log things, was that she asked questions about my retirement situation with a frequency that was slightly above what I would have expected from someone who claimed to have no financial interest. Not aggressive questions, careful ones. Do you have a good pension from your company? Or is it mainly the state pension? When you sold your apartment, was that something you planned for retirement? Or did it just happen that way? I answered honestly each time. I said I had a reasonable German state pension plus the proceeds from the flat sale, and that I was financially comfortable. I did not give numbers. She listened carefully when I answered. That was what I noticed. Most people ask questions and then wait to speak. Rosalie actually listened. I told myself this was an attractive quality in a person. Both of those things were true, by the way. It was an attractive quality. And she was listening for specific information. I think about that now. The way two things can be completely true at the same time, and you can correctly identify both of them and still only act on the one that's more comfortable. By May, I had booked the flights. Cagayan de Oro, early June. I found a serviced apartment near the Limketkai Center for 16 nights, $42,000 for the full stay, which worked out to roughly $670. Reasonable. I read the reviews carefully. I packed light. I made a list. I told myself, approaching this sensibly. The flight from Frankfurt to Manila was 11 hours, then a connecting flight south to Laguindingan Airport, which serves Cagayan de Oro, another hour and 40 minutes. I had a window seat on the domestic leg, and I watched Mindanao appear below me, green, extremely green, mountains I hadn't expected, a coastline coming into view as we descended. It was the 5th of June. I had a carry-on bag, a rain jacket I wouldn't use once, and a printed itinerary in a plastic folder that I now find slightly embarrassing to remember. Rosalie had offered to meet me at the airport. I told her yes, and then I spent a small amount of time on the forum threads about whether this was a good idea for a first meeting, whether it created obligation, whether it was too much too soon. I decided it was logistically efficient, and that I was overthinking it. She was standing near the arrivals exit with her cousin Maribel. This was the first moment I noted. She had not mentioned a cousin would be coming. She had not mentioned a cousin at all. She had described herself on her profile as the eldest in her family, which I had understood to mean siblings, not, I now realized, the more expansive network that family actually means in the Philippines. Maribel was perhaps 25, cheerful, and spoke English very quickly in a way that took me a moment to calibrate to. She seemed genuinely pleased to meet me. I decided to file the cousin under things I didn't research adequately, and moved on. The heat outside the terminal was... I had read about the heat. Reading about heat and standing in it are different experiences. It was heavy in a way that German summer heat is not. Wet. It pressed on you. By the time we reached Rosalie's cousin's car, a small Toyota that had seen considerable use, my shirt was already uncomfortable. Cagayan de Oro from the road into the city. Concrete, color, noise, diesel smell. A rooster loose on a patch of grass between two buildings. Jeepneys painted in colors that served no organizational purpose I could identify. A basketball court with no net on one hoop. A Jollibee on a corner with a line outside it at 2 in the afternoon. And then, a few blocks further, the Limketkai Center where my serviced apartment was, looking more or less like the photos, which I had verified carefully before booking. I want to say something about the first 4 days. They were good. I am going to say that plainly because I think in these kinds of stories there is a tendency to retroactively poison everything. And I don't want to do that because it would not be accurate. The first 4 days were genuinely good. Rosalie met me each morning outside my building. We walked to a small restaurant near the Divisoria Market for breakfast. The kind of place with plastic chairs and tarpaulin menus and pork adobo that arrived already on the table almost before you ordered it, with rice and a cup of something sweet they called coffee, but which was more like coffee adjacent. She ate quickly, efficiently. She was not performing. She didn't dress up for these mornings, nursing scrubs the first day, because she had an early shift and only a few hours before work, jeans and a plain top the second. She looked like herself. That mattered to me. On the third day, she took me to the night market along the Cagayan River. It was a Thursday. The river had lights strung along it and stalls selling everything. I saw grilling on charcoal, fish balls on sticks, sweet corn, a man selling phone cases from a folding table, another selling second-hand paperbacks. There was karaoke coming from somewhere I couldn't locate, and I mean really coming. The kind of sound that passes through walls, and also through your body slightly. Rosalie found this funny, my expression when the karaoke started. She said, "You get used to it." I said, "How long does that take?" She said, "You don't actually. You just stop noticing." We ate grilled corn and walked along the river, and it was, I don't know. It was not what I expected. It was better, and also more complicated, and I couldn't have said at the time what I meant by complicated. Then, day 4. We had been to SM City that afternoon. She needed something from Watson's, some vitamin her mother used, which I paid for without thinking about it because it was $180, and I was standing there. On the way back, in the grab car, she mentioned Maribel, the cousin from the airport. She said Maribel had a dental problem that had been getting worse, and that the clinic she'd gone to had quoted $18,000 for the procedure, about $280, and that the family was trying to figure out how to manage it. She said this looking out the window. Not at me, in the tone of someone describing a general situation. I said, "I can help with that." She looked at me then and said, "No, please, you're our guest, it's not your problem." But she didn't say it for very long. I transferred the $18,000 to her Gcash that evening. It took about 4 minutes. She sent a message saying, "Thank you, Wolfgang. You are so kind. Maribel is so grateful." I sat in my apartment and thought, $280. This is less than my heating bill in February. This is nothing. And it was nothing. That's the honest truth. It was $18,000, and it was nothing to me, and it was apparently significant to them, and I felt good about it. I am not going to pretend otherwise. I felt useful in a direct, uncomplicated way that I had not felt since closing help desk tickets. I think about that feeling now sometimes. The efficiency of it. Problem identified, solution applied, ticket closed. It was the same sensation. I should have noticed that. Day 7. She took me to her family's neighborhood in Bulua, about 20 minutes from the city center by tricycle, which Rosalie negotiated in Bisaya, while I held on and tried not to think about the traffic. A low concrete house behind a gate. Chickens in the yard. A sari-sari store built onto the front of the house selling sachets of shampoo and Mang Juan snacks and San Miguel from a small chest freezer. Her mother was a small woman who held both my hands when we met and said blessing, blessing, several times, while nodding. Rosalie translated this as her mother saying, I was a blessing to visit them. I thanked her. There was sinigang for lunch, which was sour and very good. And I ate more than I should have, and everyone seemed pleased by this. There were 2 younger people at the table, a boy of perhaps 17 and a girl a few years older. Rosalie introduced them as her cousins, but her mother called the girl Ate, older sister, in relation to the boy. And once, during lunch, Rosalie called the girl by name, and there was something in the tone that was not cousin to cousin. It was something else. I didn't ask. The food was very good, and the mother kept putting more on my plate, and the conversation was warm, and I didn't ask. I noted it when I got back to the apartment that evening. In the spreadsheet, under inconsistencies, I made the first entry. I flew home on the 21st of June, 16 nights total. At the airport in Laguindingan, Rosalie hugged me for a long time and said she was glad I had come. I believed her. I still believe that part, actually. One thinks she was genuinely glad. I just think she was glad for more than one reason simultaneously, and at the time I was only counting one of them. The flight back was long enough to think. I remember somewhere over Central Asia, around 3 in the morning local time, I opened the notes application on my phone and started writing down everything I wanted to remember from the trip. Not romantic things, observations, the cousin situation, the pension questions, the 2 young people at the family lunch, the way Rosalie had looked at my watch on day 12. About the watch. I had not mentioned the watch before. It is nothing special. A Casio, probably 15 years old, the kind that tells the time reliably and costs 40 euros. But it is a solid, heavy-looking watch, and on 2 separate occasions during the trip, I caught Rosalie looking at it with a brief, specific focus. Not long looks, a glance and then away. I cannot tell you with certainty what that meant. I can tell you I noticed it, and I didn't mention it. I got back to Bochum on June 22nd. The room with somebody else's curtains felt smaller than I had left it. I made coffee and opened the laptop. I decided to send a monthly transfer. Rosalie earned approximately $22,000 a month at the clinic, roughly 345, which is a reasonable nursing salary in Cagayan de Oro, but does not leave much margin after rent and food, let alone family obligations. I had read enough about Filipino family dynamics by this point to understand that her salary did not belong only to her. The eldest daughter carries the family. This is not a scam. It is simply how things work. I decided P25,000 a month, about $390, was reasonable. It was not charity. It was acknowledgement of a shared future I was, at that point, genuinely considering. I set up the first transfer through Remitly on July 1st. She acknowledged it within the hour, with a long message about how grateful she was and how she hoped to visit me in Germany before the year was over. I should tell you about July and August, because they were good months. Not uncomplicated, but good. We kept our call schedule. Monday, Wednesday, Friday, 8 o'clock my time, which was 2 in the morning her time, and she always answered, which I noted positively. She told me about her patients. I told her about learning to cook properly for the first time since Margit left, which she found both sad and funny. She sent me a recipe for sinigang. I made it badly. I sent her a photo, She sent back a voice message laughing. We discussed what a future arrangement might look like practically. She had questions about Germany, the weather, whether she could find nursing work, how the health insurance system functioned. These were reasonable questions for someone genuinely considering immigration. I answered them in detail. I sent her links to the German nursing certification reciprocity information for Filipino nurses. And then, quietly, in August, the inconsistency tab began to fill. August 3rd, a call. Wednesday evening. We were talking about her week, and she mentioned having to help her younger brother register for his new school year. Enrollment fees were apparently due. She didn't ask me for anything. She described the difficulty of covering it from her salary that month. I sat with this for a moment. Then I said, "I thought you were an only child." She paused. A short pause, less than 2 seconds. Then she said, "Oh, she was sorry. She should have explained. In the Philippines, only child sometimes means the only one of that parent combination, but she had half-siblings from her father's second relationship. They were not close, but she helped when she could." I said I understood. I didn't fully understand, but the explanation was plausible. Blended family, estranged father, half-siblings she hadn't mentioned because the relationship was complicated. These things exist. I entered it in the spreadsheet and assigned it a low weight. August 19th changed the weight. It was not a scheduled call. Rosalie's mother appeared briefly in the background of a video call, the way she occasionally did, passing through Rosalie's apartment, a quick wave at the camera. And the mother said something in Bisaya, and Rosalie replied, and then the mother was gone. I asked what her mother had said. Rosalie said she was asking about Rosalie's sister in Manila, whether she'd called recently. Sister in Manila. Not half-sister. Sister. I said, "You have a sister?" Rosalie said yes, older sister. But they weren't close. She lived in Manila with her husband. They barely spoke. She changed the subject to ask about my week. I let her change the subject. This is what I find most difficult to explain about this period. Not that I missed things, but that I saw them clearly, and chose to give them explanations rather than wait. It is the same thing a technician does when a system throws an error, and the system is still running. You log it. You don't pull the plug. Not yet. Not over one amber light. But there were now 4 entries in the inconsistency tab. Only child. Cousin at the airport. 2 young people at the family lunch described as cousins. Sister in Manila. I started paying closer attention to sentence structure. The way she described family, always slightly vague. Never a direct count, always with qualifiers. Some cousins. Family from my father's side. People we support. She never said, "I have 2 sisters and a brother." She never gave me a number. September came. The water pump repair at the family house, 8,500, she mentioned it in passing, didn't ask for money, but described managing it with difficulty. I sent 8,500 via Gcash the same evening, without being asked. She thanked me warmly. I entered the transaction in the expense column and the mention in the inconsistency tab with a note. Unprompted disclosure of financial difficulty. 3rd instance in 5 months. I remember sitting at my desk after that September call, the spreadsheet open, looking at the inconsistency tab, which now had 7 rows. And I thought, with the same flat clarity I used to feel when a fault trace finally showed me the broken node, I thought, I know what this is. I have known for several weeks what this is. The question I am actually sitting here with is not diagnostic. It is something else. The question was whether I wanted to know officially. I opened a new tab and started thinking about How to design the test. The test was designed on a Saturday evening in early October. I had a glass of water on the desk. I don't drink alcohol, never have, and the spreadsheet open on one side of the screen and a blank document on the other. I spent approximately 90 minutes on the design. This is not unusual for me. I have never understood people who make important decisions quickly. The parameters were simple. I would introduce a change in my stated financial circumstances. Not dramatic. Nothing that would seem implausible given what she already knew about me. Something credible. Something that a person genuinely interested in me as a person would respond to with concern rather than recalibration. I would deliver it naturally, in the flow of a normal call, and then I would observe the response over the following 2 weeks. I would not prompt her. I would not follow up. I would simply watch what the system did when one key variable changed. I wrote this in the document. I wrote it methodically, with numbered points. It occurs to me now, telling this to you, that I was designing the test the same way I would have written a change request at work. Problem statement, proposed intervention, success criteria, observation period. I don't know if that is funny or just accurate. The call was on October 12th, a Saturday, which was unusual. We normally called Monday, Wednesday, Friday, but she had a shift on the Friday and had asked to move it. We had been talking for about 25 minutes about ordinary things. Her mother's garden. A nurse at her clinic who had been giving her difficulty. I had told her about a walk I'd taken along the Ruhr. Then I mentioned, in a neutral tone, that I had some news about the flat settlement. I explained, calmly, factually, that there had been a legal complication, a dispute with the previous buyer about undisclosed structural issues. The case was going to arbitration, and the timeline was uncertain. The funds were frozen pending resolution. I said I didn't know yet how it would be resolved, but I was not optimistic. I said, it probably doesn't affect us, but I wanted to be honest with you about where things stand. Then I waited. She said, "Oh no, Wolfgang, that is very stressful. Are you okay?" I said I was managing. She said, "These things take time. I'm sure it will be resolved. Have you eaten today?" This was, I want to be precise here. This was a reasonable response. It was warm. It expressed concern for my well-being. She moved quickly to a practical question, rather than lingering on the financial implications. I noted all of this. What I also noted, she ended the call 18 minutes later, which was not unusual on its own. But the reason she gave was slightly vague. Something about needing to prepare for the next day, which was a Sunday. And Rosalie had never once mentioned Sunday preparations as a reason to end a call in 9 months of regular contact. I noted this. I did not say anything about it. The message response times over the following 3 days I tracked in a new column. Her pattern had been consistent for months. She typically replied within 20 to 40 minutes during waking hours, often faster. On Sunday the 13th, 1 hour and 12 minutes for the first reply after the call. On Monday, responses averaged 90 minutes. The content was warm but shorter than usual. On Tuesday, she asked how I was feeling about the legal situation, which I interpreted at the time as genuine care, and which I still think may have been genuine care. Both things can be true. Day 5, post-call. Nothing about the legal complication. No follow-up. No, did you hear from the lawyer? A person who cared about me would probably have asked. I did not read too much into this. People get busy. People are not as attentive as we might want them to be. Day 5 was also when she mentioned her mother's blood pressure medication for the first time. She brought it up in a message, not a call. Typed, not spoken. She said her mother had been managing her hypertension on a generic medication from Mercury Drug that cost $3,200 a month, roughly $50, but that the clinic had recommended switching to a better brand, which would cost more, and that she had been covering this herself, but it was becoming difficult. She said she wasn't asking for anything. She just wanted me to know what was going on in her life. She wasn't asking for anything. I have thought about that sentence a great deal. In German, we have a word, Andeutung, which means a hint or an insinuation, something stated indirectly, intended to be understood without being said directly. What Rosalie sent me was an extremely effective Andeutung. The structure was, here is a problem involving money. I am not asking you to solve it. The implication, but you could. I did not respond to the medication mention. I replied to her message with warmth. I asked about her mother's overall health, how she was managing, whether the doctor was monitoring her properly. I said nothing about the cost. I watched. She mentioned it again 6 days later. More directly this time, she said she had checked her budget, and she didn't see how she could manage it this month alongside everything else. I sent the October transfer. P25,000 lure as usual. $390. I said nothing about the medication. I wanted to see whether she would interpret the transfer as covering it and stop mentioning it, or continue. She thanked me for the transfer warmly. She continued mentioning the medication on the next call, now framed as an ongoing difficulty rather than a one-time problem. I did not send the November transfer. I want to explain what I mean by this, because there is a version of this story where I am being cruel, and a version where I am being precise, and I think the honest answer is that I was being both simultaneously. I did not tell her the transfer was coming. I did not tell her it wasn't coming. I simply did not send it. And then I watched. On November 5th, 9 days after it would normally have arrived, she asked by message whether everything was okay with the remitly, whether there was a technical issue. She had not received anything. I replied, "Yes, I think there may have been a problem on my end. I am looking into it." This was not true. I said it because I wanted to see what happened next, not what happened when she believed it was definitively finished. On November 7th, she mentioned a family situation that had come up and was requiring urgent attention. She didn't specify. She said she was managing, but it was a difficult month. On November 10th, she initiated a call, which was not a scheduled call day. The call lasted 11 minutes. She was warm throughout. She mentioned, briefly, and without dwelling on it, that the family situation was still unresolved, and that she had been praying about it. She did not ask directly for money. Not once in the entire period. This I want to acknowledge fairly. She never made a direct request. But the indirect structure was so consistent, so precisely calibrated to create pressure without creating confrontation, that I found it almost, I don't know the right word, almost impressive. In a technical sense, the architecture was very clean. On November 14th, I opened the spreadsheet and looked at the totals. Transfers July through October, $100,000, approximately $1,560. Dental emergency, June, $18,000. $280 water pump, September, $8,500. $133. Trip costs, flights, accommodation, meals, transport, gifts, approximately $2,230. Total, approximately $4,200. I sat with that number. It was not catastrophic. It was what I spent on the Essen Flats bathroom renovation in 2019 and didn't think about again. But I was not actually sitting with the number. I was sitting with what the number meant, which was that I had spent 9 months in a process that had felt like something and had turned out, on examination, to be something different from what I thought. The test had confirmed the hypothesis. The test had worked exactly as designed. I closed the transfer application and did not reopen it. After I stopped sending money, I stopped sleeping well. I want to be precise about this too, because I think it is relevant. It was not guilt exactly. I had not stolen anything. I had not been cruel. I had made a decision based on evidence I had gathered carefully over 9 months, and the decision was correct. And I still lay awake at 2 in the morning in Bochum, listening to the street outside, and feeling something I did not have a clean word for. The contact wound down the way a system winds down when you start withdrawing resources from it. Gradually, then suddenly, then not at all. The last call we had was on November 22nd. She had initiated it, not a scheduled day. She was warm for the first few minutes. She asked about my health. She mentioned she had been praying for the legal situation to resolve. And then, about 7 minutes in, she mentioned that there was a family situation she needed to discuss. Her youngest sibling, and she said sibling this time, not cousin, which I noted, was having a problem at school that required some fees to be paid urgently. And she had been trying to manage everything herself, but this month had been very difficult. She paused. I said, "How much do they need?" She said, "Around 12,000, maybe 15,000. She was embarrassed to ask. I said I would see what I could do with the situation on my end first, and that I would let her know. She said she understood. She said God would provide. She said she hoped things would be better soon. We ended the call 11 minutes after it started. I sat at my desk for a while. P12,000 to P15,000. That is roughly $190 to $235. The range itself was interesting. She had not done the calculation firmly enough to give me a single number. Or she had offered a range deliberately, to let me choose the higher one. I do not know which. I logged this in the notes column without assigning a weight, because by this point the analysis was academic. I sent no money. I did not reply to the next 2 messages she sent over the following week. They were brief. "Wolfgang, I hope you are okay, and I am thinking of you, hope to talk soon." And they had the particular quality of messages sent to test whether a line is still active, rather than because the sender particularly needs a response. On December 3rd, the messages stopped. That was the end. No confrontation, no final call, no admission or accusation from either of us. She stopped when the signal went quiet, the same way any sensible operator would stop trying to connect to a server that wasn't responding. I found this, honestly, more instructive than anything she had said or not said across the previous 9 months. The cleanliness of the exit told me something about how many times she had done this before. Or perhaps it just told me she was a practical person. I genuinely cannot say. I told Peter over coffee in December. He listened without interrupting, which is unusual for Peter. When the first finished, he said, "So you lost about 4,000 euros, and 9 months." I said, "Yes." He said, "And you're okay?" I said, "I am working on a correct answer to that question." He nodded. He ordered another coffee. We talked about other things. I want to tell you what I actually lost, because I think the money is not the most accurate description of it. The $4,200 I can account for cleanly. Transfers, $1,560. Dental, $280. Water pump, $133. Trip, $2,230, including flights, accommodation, 16 days of meals, transport, gifts. I brought good German chocolate as Paselubong, which Rosalie told me her family had never tried, and which they apparently ate in one sitting, which I found genuinely charming at the time, and still find charming, actually, even now. That part wasn't a performance. Neither was her laugh that evening at the river market. Neither was the sinigang her mother made, which was the best thing I ate in the Philippines and possibly the best thing I ate in 2024. None of that was nothing. That is the complicated part, What one lost beyond the money was another year and a half added to a much longer account. 23 years since Margaret left, and what I had been doing for 9 months was constructing, very carefully, the precise conditions under which I could feel what I felt in that first week in Cagayan de Oro: useful, interesting, present, while maintaining enough methodological distance that I could tell myself I was in control of the process. The test was not about Rosalie. I understood this at some point in December, sitting at the desk, looking at the spreadsheet with the inconsistency tab and the expense column and the notes field going back 9 months. The test was about me having something to do with my hands while I decided whether to let myself want something. And when the test returned, the result I designed it to return, I had a correct answer, and still had the original problem. 61 years old. $153,800 in the account. German state pension arriving reliably at $1,340 a month. The room with somebody else's curtains. I have not deleted the spreadsheet. I keep thinking I will, and then I don't. I don't fully understand why. Maybe it is just professional habit. You keep the incident documentation even after the case is closed, in case you need to refer back. Or maybe I just want evidence that something happened, that I went somewhere and tried something and noticed things and kept records, the way I always have. That is not nothing either. That is what I have for you. I hope it is useful to someone. I think it probably will be. And with that, we come back to you, the viewer, and to Inside the Philippines. Wolfgang's story is not one we tell here very often. He didn't lose everything. He got out, as he would put it, before the fault cascade became a total system failure. By the numbers, he's one of the fortunate ones. But I think you heard what he said at the end. The money was never really the point. The point was a drawer with a photograph in it, and a calendar with nothing written on it, and a man who is very good at measuring everything except the distance between where he is and where he wants to be. If you're watching this and you're planning your own research phase, your own spreadsheet, your own risk assessment before heading to the Philippines, Wolfgang's story has something important to say to you. The preparation is not the protection. Knowing the architecture of how these things work doesn't make you immune to wanting something badly enough that you explain away the early data. Know your numbers, know the culture, learn about utang na loob and family obligation, and why a nursing assistant in Cagayan de Oro earning $22,000 a month might see a retired German man with a sold flat very differently than he sees himself. Know all of that, and then also know why you're really going. Thank you for spending this time with us on Inside the Philippines. If this story helped you or made you think, share it with someone who might need to hear it. And we'll be here because these stories keep coming, and someone needs to tell them honestly. Take care of yourselves. We'll see you next time. It is now April 2025. I am still in the room in Bochum. Different curtains. I finally bought my own, a plain dark blue. Nothing interesting. I walk along the Ruhr most mornings when the weather allows. I make the sinigang recipe Rosalie sent me sometimes, though mine is still not as good as her mother's. I have accepted that it probably never will be. I want to tell you 3 things that I think are actually useful. Not lessons in the way that word usually gets used, not tidy summaries where a person extracts wisdom and becomes improved. More like observations from the data that I think are worth passing on to the next person sitting at their laptop in a room with somebody else's curtains. The first is about the test. People will hear this story and think the test was a good idea. Maybe they will even think about designing their own. I want to be careful here, because the test was not what protected me. The test confirmed something I already knew. The spreadsheet had 7 rows of inconsistencies before I introduced any false information. If I had read those 7 rows correctly in August instead of waiting until October to run a controlled experiment, the outcome would have been the same, and I would have saved 2 additional months and approximately $800. The test felt like action. It felt like I was doing something methodical and intelligent rather than just ending a thing I didn't want to end. This is worth understanding about yourself if you are the type of person who runs tests. Sometimes the test is just a delay mechanism in a better suit. The second thing is about Rosalie specifically, and I want to get this right because I think it is easy to get wrong. I do not believe she was a bad person. I have thought about this considerably, and I keep arriving at the same place. She was 34 years old, earning $22,000 a month as a nursing assistant, about $345, in a city where that salary had to stretch to cover her own rent, food, and what sounded like at minimum 3 or 4 people who depended on her in some degree. Her mother, a sibling, possibly more. This is not unusual. This is just the arithmetic of being an eldest daughter in a provincial Filipino family with no safety net. She saw a retired German man who owned property and called himself financially comfortable. From where she was sitting, the question of whether to include him in her support network was not a moral question. It was a practical one. The dishonesty was in the presentation, the only child framing, the family members who appeared gradually rather than being disclosed, but the underlying logic was not malicious. It was survival arithmetic applied to a situation where the Kano with the nice watch had just arrived at the airport. I do not say this to excuse it. I say it because I think understanding it accurately is more useful than being angry about it. And I think some of the men who get hurt in these situations stay hurt longer than they need to because they spent the aftermath deciding how villainous the other person was rather than understanding what actually happened. The third thing is harder to say and is probably the most important. I mentioned Margaret at the beginning. The note on the kitchen counter in 2001, I told you I had been running the diagnostic on what went wrong for 23 years and never found a satisfying answer. This is true, but I want to add something I did not say at the start, which is that I have always known, what the actual problem with the diagnostic is. The diagnostic assumed there was a fault to find, a specific error, something that, if I located it and corrected it, would explain the failure and prevent recurrence. This is how I think. This is how I have always thought. There is a problem. There is a solution. There is a correct procedure. Margaret did not leave because of a fault. She left because she was a person with her own needs that I was not meeting in ways that I, if I am being precise, probably never asked her about carefully enough. This is not a fault in a system. This is just 2 people who were not well matched and stayed too long because neither of them knew how to say so. And what I did in the Philippines, when I created the profile and built the spreadsheet and designed the test, was apply the same logic again. Here is the problem. Here is the procedure. Here is how I verify the result. Ticket created. Ticket closed. The thing I kept not doing, the thing I am still not doing currently in April 2025 in the room with the dark blue curtains, is the thing that doesn't have a procedure. The thing that requires sitting with uncertainty and not measuring it. Letting something be ambiguous and staying in the room with the ambiguity rather than opening a new tab and starting to document it. I do not know how to do that. I am 61 years old, and I am working on it. That is all I have. I hope it is enough for someone. And so we come to the end of Wolfgang's story, and to the end of this episode of Inside the Philippines. What stayed with me, listening to Wolfgang, was that line near the end. The test was just a delay mechanism in a better suit. He could see the problem clearly. He built an elegant structure around not acting on it, And then, when the structure confirmed what he already knew, he sat in his flat in Bochum and understood that the spreadsheet had never been about Rosalie at all. That's not a Philippine story. That's a human story. The Philippines just happened to be where Wolfgang brought it. If you're watching this, and you recognize something of yourself in him, the research, the planning, the measuring of things that maybe can't be measured, that recognition is the thing worth sitting with. Not as a criticism, just as information. Be careful out there. Know the territory before you land. Understand what utang na loob means and why 22,000 a month means something very different in Mindanao than it does in Dortmund. Keep your assets protected and your expectations honest. And if you catch yourself designing a test to answer a question you already know the answer to, stop. Read the 7 rows. Close the ticket earlier. This has been Inside the Philippines. We'll be here next time. Take good care of yourselves.